Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Suneel Gupta and Debbie Millman. Thanks for joining us tonight. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for a few introductions. Suneel Gupta lost his Dharma and then discovered it again. He studies the most extraordinary people on the planet to discover and share simple, actionable habits to lift our performance and deepen our daily sense of purpose. His work has been featured by major outlets, including CNBC, TED, and the New York Times. His latest book is Everyday Dharma, 8 Essential Practices for Finding Success and Joy in What You Do. He hosts the documentary series Business Class, available now on Amazon Prime, now in its 3rd season. As Suneel put it to me, it's like Anthony Bourdain for leadership. What's not to love? He travels the country interviewing innovative entrepreneurs and their extraordinary businesses. Suneel also has 2 local connections I'd like to highlight. He holds an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. It's just a stone's throw from where I'm sitting, and a law degree from Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law as well. It would take most of our remaining time to do justice to Debbie Millman's amazing career. Debbie is the host of the Webby Award-winning podcast Design Matters, one of the first and longest-running podcasts in the world. She is the chair of the first ever Masters in Branding program at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. She's co-owner and editorial director of printmag.com and the author of 7 books on design and branding, one better than the next. Debbie has worked on the design and strategy of over 200 of the world's largest brands, and she is the recipient of a Cooper Hewitt National Design Award and a Lifetime Achievement Award from, I'm going to say AIGA, though you're going to correct me if I'm wrong on that, the Professional Association for Design. I don't know if this will say AIGA. I'll let you tell me. Let's welcome Suneel Gupta and Debbie Millman.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. Suneel, it's so wonderful to see you.
Hey, Debbie. Nice to reconnect with you. And thanks, Lon, for that
Absolutely.
introduction.
I have so many questions for you. Sometimes you get a book in the mail, as I did with yours, and think, oh, interesting, nice cover, look at the back, see what it's a little bit about. And then I rifled through it because you're my friend, and I realized that this is the book that the universe has sent me because I need it so badly. So this is going to be, I think, a fairly personal interview, only because I have become so enthralled with your ideas and I'm trying to implement them in my own life. So just wanted to tell you at the outset. But before we get started talking about the book, just to ground our audience in a little bit of history, some people may not know that you were the face of failure for the New York Times. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about that and share how it paved the path to where you are today.
Sure. Yes. Well, I started my career after graduating from the joint program I did at Northwestern. I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and I wanted it really bad. The problem is that the first 2 companies that I started both did not work. And then I joined another company that some people here might be familiar with, Groupon. And Groupon did very well in the early days. And I was first product manager on staff, so I got to see the growth. And we ended up taking the company public within a few short years. But then a lot of that came crashing down as well. So we lost nearly $20 billion in market value within a few financial quarters. So I get invited to be a speaker at an organization called FailCon, which literally stands for Failure Conference. Now, this was 2014, and failure was not one of those topics that a lot of people talked about. And then all of a sudden, it seemed like everybody was talking about it. And the New York Times happened to be in the audience, somebody from the New York Times, and they did a full-length expose on failure. And they used my face up on that stage speaking at FailCon as the cover photo for this article. And the story goes so viral that, I kid you not, you could have Googled the word failure. Like, that's it. Just the word failure, and my face would have been the top search result. So it's pretty embarrassing, right? I mean, here I am trying to be seen as like a success, trying to be perceived as successful. And, if you Google my name or even the word failure, they are synonymous with one another on the internet. And so I got a piece of advice at the time, which was to use something with like do something with that article. Don't let it go to waste, you know? It's a crisis. Don't let it not turn into an opportunity. And so what I started to do is I started to email this article out to all these people that I admired, people who had no idea who I was, from Oscar-winning filmmakers to celebrity chefs to coaches of professional sports teams. And I would basically send them a link to the article and I would say, hey, as you can see, I don't know what I'm doing. Would you be willing to give me some advice? And the response rate to that email was just extraordinarily high. And because I was reaching out to them through the penumbra of failure instead of success, it just opened up these honest conversations. And they were open with me about their mistakes and their setbacks, and things I could not read about in their online bios or their LinkedIn profiles. And so I started to find that I was sitting on almost this set of data, um, conversations, stories of some of the most extraordinary people on the planet, and I had access to things that I couldn't find online. So I started to write about that. And eventually that writing became blog posts, it became articles, and eventually it became books. And here we are 10 years later, and what I really do for a living is I go out and I study people who I think have reached the top of their game to unpack the habits that really took them there. And my sort of unique twist on it, I think, is that I try to find them at their lowest moments. So what were the times that didn't go the way they were planned, and how did they rise again?
What provoked you to write Everyday Dharma?
Yeah, one of the ideas that I had all along the way, it was really a question, which is like, why is it that certain people are able to build momentum in their lives and in their work? And why do other people fizzle out? And one of the ideas that I kept rubbing up against over and over again was what Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar called the arrival fallacy. Uh,
Mm.
and the arrival fallacy is this idea that we are going to reach this moment in our life where we will have accumulated enough wealth, enough status, enough success, where we're finally going to feel like we have arrived. And that is going to make us whole inside. And what I was realizing is that so many people who even had achieved great things on paper were still not very happy. And I was trying to figure out sort of what is this relationship with the arrival fallacy that we have. And interestingly enough, the more I dug into that, I wanted to figure out what the cutting edge theories were around that, what was the science behind it. But I kept getting called back to this 1,000-year-old philosophy called Dharma. And when I say called back, I mean that because as a kid, this was something that I was exposed to. I was exposed to at the temple. It was a conversation that I had with my grandfather many, many years ago on his porch in New Delhi. Um, but I had sort of turned my back on it. And part of the reason for that is because I grew up in a pretty much all-white neighborhood. I went to a pretty much an all-white school, and I wanted to do whatever I could to, I guess, not be the Indian kid, not be the brown kid. And so anything that kind of had an Indian essence to it, I would sort of I would not pay attention to deliberately. I would overwear Bruce Springsteen t-shirts. There were times when I would put baby powder on my face to make myself look more white. So again, anything that felt Indian, I would sort of turn my back on. But all of a sudden, I found myself being called back to this idea of what did these people know over 1,000 years ago about this idea of the arrival fallacy and how we find real fulfillment in our life while we pursue a path of ambition.
I thoroughly related to the arrival fallacy and have been, as I now understand from your book, plagued by this for
Mm.
my entire career.
Mm.
I remember back in 1983 when I graduated college, I was completely broke. I was living hand to mouth. There were months I wasn't sure if I could pay my student loan, my rent, or buy food. And I remember thinking if I could just save $1,000, I would feel safe.
Yeah.
I would be happy. I could do so many other things. I would feel free. And it took a couple of years, but I finally did it. And when I did it, guess what happened? Then I thought, $1,000 isn't really enough, even in 1983 or 85 at that point. And then it was 2000, and then it was 5,000. So I realized even then that nothing was going to give me that sense of safety and security, but knowing it is very different than still trying to seek some sort of safety and security.
The
So
goalposts
you
continue
mentioned
to
your
move.
grandfather. I'm sorry?
I was going to say, there was a study that was done, Debbie, that actually crossed all income ranges. And I asked people, how much would it take? How much do you need to have in the bank in order to feel that sense of safety and happiness, fulfillment? And the answer across all income ranges, for people who were barely making ends meet, all the way to people who were uber wealthy, was twice as much as I have right now.
Oh.
And so, and so the goalpost continues to move over and over again. And the complication, just to make sure that we're not coming from a place of judgment here. The complication of all of this is that, on the other hand, it does fuel us, right? It drives us, right? And it can be a source of ambition. And so there is a sense of staying hungry that we don't want to lose, right? And that's really kind of what I was after with this book. Was I didn't want to write something that sounded good on Instagram. Meaning I didn't want to say, hey, don't worry about your ambition, stop and smell the roses, because that's not true to who I am either. I feel like I'm constantly striving, and I know a lot of people who are joining us today can probably relate to that as well. We want to do things, we want to create things, we want to build things. But so how do we have that drive still, and still not be caught in this idea of arrival?
Is it a psychological instinct to always be striving for more? Why do so many of us arrive at some goal or some benchmark and then suddenly raise the goal or raise the benchmark? Why does that seem so innately wired in us?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that was sort of, I think, laid out for me when I was out there researching Dharma, and I talked to many, many different practitioners, people who are putting this into practice from all around the world, and when I was in Bhutan, which is a country that's tucked between India and China, it's based in the Himalayas. I started to get introduced to this idea of outer success versus inner success. So outer success is wealth, it is status, it is achievement, and then inner success is joy, it's fulfillment, it's a sense of meaning and happiness. And I think that, the trouble I was having, at least, was, well, which one is better? Is it outer success or is it inner success, right? And I would sort of, if you looked at my world, if you met me on any given day and you said, hey, how are things going? You would see my answer sort of come from a positioning of outer success. And sometimes I'd be like, screw outer success. I'm all about the joy and fulfillment of what's happening today. And I kind of flip-flop back and forth. It was like I was in yoga mode and then non-yoga mode, right? And like, I think a lot of people are that way, right? And still, to a certain degree, after writing this book, I can find myself flip-flopping between these two different worlds. I think that the balance here of Dharma is in not choosing one or the other, right? I think both can be part of your world. Like, outer success can be important and inner success can be important. The fallacy, though, is that outer success is going to lead us to inner success, right? So knowing or believing that you're going to accumulate enough where, again, you're going to feel this sense of inner success, it doesn't work that way. However, it can work the other way, meaning if you can start with inner success, you can start with what it is that truly makes you happy, and you're creating work for the work's sake, that can spill over into outer success. And I wanted this book to really sort of be, evidence of that, not just at, like, at the name brand level, right? Not just household names, but for nurses, for frontline workers, for assembly workers who were able to sort of flip the switch on that and start with the position of inner success and let that flow into everything that they do. I was reminded, actually, Debbie, I never told you this, I never wrote you this email, but I felt like I had like pressure on the send button, and I was like, oh, it's a sloppy email, I'm not going to send this. But you and I, when we spoke a couple of years ago about my last book, one of the stories you brought up was the story of Joni Mitchell and how much she inspired you. And it's pretty amazing because her Grammy performance, I mean, oh my
Mm,
gosh, it's unbelievable. But you actually were one of the first people that talked to me about sort of this idea of, for somebody like Joni Mitchell, what made a lot of what made her special was this idea of, I'm not creating music for this external validation. I'm purely going to create music that I love, right? And if I can do that, then the energy that I put into it is going to be very different than if I'm trying to create a hit. And again, like that's Joni Mitchell. I know, like, household name, but we see that at an everyday level as well. If you are doing
absolutely.
that, you like, I think that there's a belief that purpose will lead you to joy, right? If I can find my purpose in life, then that's going to make me happy. And that's to a certain degree true, but it also works the other way. If you can find what makes you happy, those bright spots can also lead you into your purpose. And that's really kind of the point of this book.
Another artist that I feel has followed the path to their own muse is Judy Chicago, who's also now finally, after decades and decades of work, is finally getting the type of recognition she really deserves. But I really want to go back to the beginning. You talked about the conversation you had with your grandfather.
Yeah.
Everyday Dharma begins with you and your grandfather sitting on a porch in New Delhi and him introducing you to the word Dharma. And you write this: if you look hard enough at your own story, you'll find a moment that feels like the true beginning. For me, it's sitting on the porch of my dad's childhood home in New Delhi. I'm 7 years old and I'm seated next to my 72-year-old grandfather. Suneel, can you share with us, take us back to that moment and share what happened next?
Yeah. Yeah. So, 7 years old, visiting New Delhi. I'm completely jet lagged and I'm like a little kid with a lot of energy. And so what that means practically is like 4:30 a.m. my eyes shoot open and I'm in this brand new house, like this place I had never we arrived the night before and now I'm all of a sudden in my dad's childhood home where he grew up in New Delhi. And I'm really excited and I wake up and the house is completely quiet and I'm kind of walking through these like corridors and suddenly I see this like large man sitting on the porch. And I realized from the pictures, because I hadn't met him the night before he was sleeping, I realized from the photos that that was my grandfather. And so I go out onto the porch and he immediately recognizes me. It's the first time we're meeting each other. And he calls me over. He says, "Ow," which basically means come. And I go and I sit next to him and we watch the streets of New Delhi come alive. I mean, fruit cart vendors in the street, cows are ambling to pasture, rickshaw drivers are cranking their engines for the first time, and I'm watching this scene, and it's really electric for a kid from suburban Michigan to see all this happening. And my grandfather, who's like this legendarily large man, he's sitting next to me, and he's just kind of he's sipping on his chai. And at some point, he points to a flag of India because there's a flag that's sort of waving in the distance. And he asked me if I know about the flag. What's the significance of the colors? And then he tells me about it, and then he points me to the center of the flag. And at the center of the flag is you'll see a blue wheel, a navy blue wheel. And he tells me that that is the wheel of Dharma. And the wheel of Dharma is really a representation of your life as your life starts as you get older, the wheel will start to spin faster and faster and faster. You start to get busy with priorities, all the things that you need to do in your life. And at the center of the wheel is really your Dharma, right? It is who you are and how who you are gets expressed through what you do. And the message that my grandfather had for me, and this is for a 7-year-old kid, and I've had to go back to this over and over again through my memory, is him telling me, listen, there's nothing you can do about getting sucked to the outside of the wheel. That's a natural part of life. But the thing that we always have to remember is that when we find ourselves at the outside of the wheel, we must find our way back to the center.
Mm.
And so for me, writing this book was very much coming from a place of like, I feel stuck in the arrival fallacy. I feel like I'm burning out. I feel like I'm doing this work each day, but I feel like in some ways I'm falling further and farther behind. What can I do to find my way back to the center, and maybe help some other people do the same?
Dharma is a Sanskrit word, and its definition has been interpreted by communities around the world, from Buddhist monasteries to Burning Man camps. There are lots of interpretations of Dharma, as you write in your book. After all your research and thinking on the topic, can you give us a simple way to think about what it means?
Yeah, and I like that you're asking for a simple way because for me, it's such a vast subject and I needed a simple framework. And the clearest way I think to think about Dharma is that Dharma is equal to essence plus expression. Essence plus expression. So essence is who you are, and expression is how you show up in the world. And so when you are expressing your essence, even in a small way, you begin to feel more confident, you feel more creative, you feel more like yourself. And when you're not, when those two things are not aligned, it's very difficult to feel like you're in your Dharma. You know, you can be busy, and again, on paper, you can look really good. Your career can look like you're a rising star, but at the same time, something will feel off. And I think that the challenge sometimes with this is that when you think about a concept like Dharma, it almost feels like, all right, I need to make some really abrupt moves. I need to quit my job. I need to move to Bali and I need to go meditate for a long time in order to figure out what my Dharma is. And I wanted to dispel that because this is an alignment exercise. And if you can align essence and expression just by a little bit, you can start to feel a whole more like yourself. And so the book is really about these rituals, these little practices that we can do to make that alignment a little more clear. And also to recognize that there are so many things in our life that can take us out of our Dharma. The natural occurrences of day-to-day life, we can get swept back into the busyness. So once we start to find that place, how do we stay there?
So does everybody have Dharma within them?
I think so. Everybody has an essence. And you know, it's something that I think a lot of us aren't in touch with anymore. I do believe that every one of us has been in touch with it at some point in time. When I'm out there talking to audiences now and working with people who feel like they have lost their Dharma, oftentimes it's something that they experienced when they were a kid. If they can go back and they can talk to people who knew them when they were a child, oftentimes that person's like, well, of course, I knew that about you all along. But but
Yeah.
but we lose sight of that, right? It is in the book, I use the metaphor of Michelangelo, who would look at a block of marble and he would say the sculpture is already inside. All we have to do is peel back. We have to chisel away the layers that are hiding the statue. And I think Dharma works very much the same way. You know, it's already inside of you. You don't have to go looking for it. Some of us are in touch with it in a small way every day. And again, some of us, it's been buried under so many other things, priorities, judgments, other people's expectations, all the other things we have to do in our life, pickups, drop-offs, aging parents. I mean, it's a lot, right? And it can be very easy to lose sight of it. So in the book, you know, one of the ways that we begin is by offering some of the chisels. What are these little things that we can do and ask ourselves to start coming back to who we are?
Suneel, there's a paragraph in your book that I related to in a really profound way. It's probably about 10 or 15 lines long, and I'd really like to read it and then talk to you about it.
Okay.
You write this in Everyday Dharma. My first startup failed, and so did my second. When I decided to give it one more try, I felt that everything was on the line: my pride, my dignity, and my dwindling bank account. For the next several years, I bootstrapped my life, took a $0 salary, and worked harder than I ever had before. It was a high-stress existence, and the pressure took a toll. I was constantly sick, stressed out, and sleep-deprived. It became more and more difficult to get out of bed in the morning. I told myself it didn't matter because once I made my dream a reality, once I finally had the success, status, and wealth I was after, the joy would return and the emptiness I was feeling would fade away. But a couple of weeks after the sale, I woke up to a sinking realization. Those good feelings had disappeared. In fact, I didn't feel any happier than I had before. I was having trouble making sense of it. This was supposed to be my moment, the one that made all the years of hard work and sacrifice feel worthwhile, the moment when everything would finally be okay. Instead, I felt emptier than ever before. I genuinely believed that something was broken inside of me. Aside from the startup part, I could have written that. Well, maybe not as well. But in any case, there's so much I want to talk to you about this. One thing that I do want to mention is I write a column for print magazine, and it's called What Matters. And it's a Proustian questionnaire, 10 questions, the same questions to everyone. The answers are obviously wildly different. One of the questions is, how long does the feeling of pride last after a success or an accomplishment?
Wow.
The average answer, average, is a week. I've had some people say as little as 10 minutes, and maybe one person in 3 years has said 3 weeks.
Wow. And these are probably incredible. These are incredible.
Yes, they're artists, they're designers, they're makers, they're thinkers, they're educators. Why is this feeling so elusive? We chase it and we chase it and we chase it. And most of the time for creative people, we're making things to make it. And yet
Yeah.
dissipates. That feeling of pride, of success, of joy, of love.
Yeah.
What's it? Why?
You know, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know, and what I know is that I experience it at a deep level. Um, what I also know is that I think there's some fear of turning that switch off
Hmm.
because I think that if, in my case, this idea of, well, can you be satisfied with what it is that you have? If I turn that part of me off, where is the ambition going to come from? Where is the source of fuel going to come from to go do the work? Um, and am I going to look back and say that you could have gone out and you could have done all these things and you didn't because you chose this sort of feeling of being satisfied instead? And would I look
Hmm.
back on that with regret? And that's scary. Um, and so I don't know what it is that creates the sensation or creates the feeling. What I was really after is that true? Meaning, if I did turn the switch off there, could there be another source of fuel? Could I still
Hmm.
be just as ambitious? Could I still want to serve at the level? Do I still want to create and make at the level if I didn't have this sort of need and desire of this moment of arrival or more status or more success or more wealth? And the answer is absolutely. I mean, and not only is it absolutely, this conversation that you and I are having right now has been had for thousands of years. It is, I mean, one of the stories that I sort of ground the book in is what was happening in India before the word Dharma came to be. The reason the word came to be is because India, this is over 1,000 years ago, at one point in time it was the wealthiest country in the world per capita, meaning that it was about a third of the world's GDP, and there were highly, highly concentrated areas of wealth. And there was a lot of progress happening. Huts were turning into homes, tattered sheets were turning into finely stitched clothing, entrepreneurs were starting to make their way. It was a really exciting golden era in South Asia. But there was a real rift happening. And it was really interesting a couple of years ago when we started talking about the Great Resignation and everything that was happening in sort of the haze of the pandemic, because 1,000 years before the Great Resignation, there was this great divide happening in India. And it was almost the same exact debate, where it was like a lot of people were quitting their jobs or they were leaving their work because they were like, look, yeah, we've made a lot of progress as a society, but are we any happier as a result? And the other side was saying, well, look at everything that's happening. It's magical. Like, we've completely transformed where we live. We've been able to create all this upward mobility. And so it was a real sort of debate that was happening. And what ended up happening was that a lot of these people who quit their jobs and quit their roles, they moved back to the forests. They basically said, look, we're going to go back to a life of contemplation. And when they did that, they started to realize that they kind of missed what was happening in the outside world, right?
Yeah.
Like they wanted the grounding that came with meditation. They wanted the grounding that came with being around community, around other people, but they also missed the idea of making things and building things. And so how did they have both? What could we do to fuse these worlds together? And that out of that sort of desire of can I have both? Can I be grounded in who I am and not be so desirous of like all these things, but at the same time also make and create and be creative. Really out of the blending of those two things is where this idea and philosophy of Dharma came to be.
You say that Dharma is equal to essence and expression.
Yeah.
And essence is who you are, and expression is what you do. And your grandfather believed that everyone has an essence, something deep inside of us that's uniquely assigned by the universe, which I love. And this goes deeper than talent or skill. It's a calling, an inner necessity. How does one figure out what that is?
Yeah. Well, it is deeper than an occupation because I think oftentimes when I talk about Dharma and it's amazing now, like I'm starting to talk to audiences, companies that I wouldn't have thought would care about a topic like this, but I am, and I think one of the biggest sort of I think places that people go when they think about purpose and calling is a profession,
Right.
doctor, lawyer, accountant, designer, right? Author. Um, but Dharma is deeper than that. Essence is deeper than that. It is about sort of I like to make things, I like to build things, I like to inspire people, I like to tell stories. And the reason that matters is because an essence might have multiple expressions. And we see that right now with the modern career, right? We have people who are not only just changing roles now, but changing entire industries. And some people are doing multiple things at once. And I think that's directionally where things are heading. And by the way, I think that's very true to who we are. We may have one essence, right? But we can have multiple ways of expressing that essence. Like for me, I really do enjoy telling stories. I found this out about myself when I was running a company, which is a weird place to discover this about yourself. But I was running a tech company. I had started it. It was called Rise. We did one-on-one health coaching. And my job was to be fully like in like the leadership role and also in the numbers, like in the dashboards, like looking at like the way the funnels were operating, how do we get more customers, how do we retain customers? But you know what the thing was that I enjoyed more than anything else? It was the stories. Like every time I could read a customer story or I could talk to a customer, I could feel myself energetically light up. And if I could relay that story to investors, to partners, to the team especially, I felt myself just like really kind of tingle, right? And so there was this idea of storytelling, but I was like caught in this like tech CEO type of role, which there was no connection. So I started to spend mornings really kind of doubling down on this, writing stories, writing, like just writing, expressing in that way. What I realized is that I didn't need to leave my job. It wouldn't have been possible even in that moment to leave my job to start expressing that essence. I could start to bring more stories into my day. I could start to tell more stories to my team as a way of motivating them and showing them the impact that we were having. And as soon as I started to do that, again, not like leaving my job, but just aligning a little bit more and more, I started to feel myself come alive. And today, what I kind of realized is that like again, if in essence is I love to tell stories, there's so many different ways to express that. There's podcasts, there's books, there's what you and I are doing right now. There's speaking, there's going to my kids' school and reading books, which is like one of my favorite things to do, right? There are so many ways to express myself as a storyteller. So as soon as we can go beneath this mindset of an occupation and into a mindset of essence, when we can get to that place, that starts to open up possibilities. And we can start to say, all right, yeah, here are all the ways that I can express that. But I want to make sure I answer your question too, Debbie, because I think you asked about like what are specific ways too that we can start to think about what our essence is. And to me, I really do think that there is a cross section between competence and curiosity here. So
Mm.
in other words, what am I good at? There's some natural gift I think that can come with Dharma, although some of us haven't necessarily explored that enough to know that it's a gift. But I do think that once you start to kind of sink your teeth into it, you kind of realize, wow, like there is some competence there. I am sort of naturally good at this, but I think the other part of it is even more important, which is what am I curious about? What do I
Mhm.
want? What do I want to keep getting better at? I go, so I have an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old right now, and they're both starting to show signs of competence. But what, like, my older daughter loves to sing, for example, and I love that, and she's good at it, and she like does like when she sings, like she does like come alive in an interesting way, and I love it. But what I'm really paying attention to is like, is there that thirst to get better? And is that thirst to like keep growing and like wanting more of that? Because I think that way more than competence is a much clearer signal for Dharma. Right? Like for me, I wasn't a writer. I didn't have that background. I started speech writing early in the day, but I did not know how to write books. But like I felt more curious about that than I ever did in tech. Like I wanted to know everything there was about what it took to craft good chapters. How do you tell good stories? How do you string together a narrative? I would reach out to as many people as I possibly could, and I was like this bottomless pit. So even though I wasn't a very good writer to begin with, I knew that like I had this just like thirst to want to get better. And I think that for ourselves and for the people around us, when we're helping kids or partners or friends find their dharma, following curiosity, I think is much more important than following competence.
Yeah, I think we're socialized from a very early age to begin to narrow how we view ourselves. And you write this in the book. From an early age, we're conditioned to skip past essence and go straight to an occupation. For example, you write in the book, what do you want to be when you grow up is a question we've all been asked from kindergarten to college. The answer people expect is always a job title. You couldn't say, I want to boost people's confidence in their appearance. It was, I want to be a fashion designer or a fitness instructor or an orthodontist. And then this carries on into our adulthood. What do you want to be turns into, what do you do? Our identity and title become intertwined. We become convinced that we're our job and consumed by what other people think of it. And this felt like the core of this realization felt like the core to reprogram how we think about our calling, which I know is also a big word in Dharma,
Yeah.
in understanding Dharma. What duty do we have to our calling?
Yeah.
And how can people begin to start to peel away those layers of occupation or expectation to
Yeah.
find and discover their essence?
Yeah. I think one of the chisels, so in the book, I talk about these different chisels that we can use. One of the chisels that I think is the simplest to put into practice is really starting to identify the bright moments, what I call the bright spots in your day. And particularly, it could be in your work, it could be with your family, but these little moments that are bringing you joy. And oftentimes, I talk to people now that feel they come to me and they said, I'm pretty miserable with what it is that I do each day, right? And one of the things I ask them is, can you start to identify these little moments where you don't feel miserable, where you actually do feel happy, even if they're fleeting? And the reason that matters is because I mean, we come across this concept that neuroscientists call hedonic adaptation, right? Which is that we tend to focus a lot on the moments that don't bring us joy, but we kind of skip past very quickly the moments that do. And that's not to say that I'm not advocating here that we need to, stop and smell the roses necessarily, but what I am saying is that sometimes we're missing information. We're missing critical information about
Yeah,
what our
absolutely. I mean, I just want to interrupt you for one moment and say, think back to how long that feeling of accomplishment lasts, which is infinitesimal. And then how long does regret and heartbreak last? Sometimes it feels like it goes on forever. So that's another sort of point to what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, one of the groups that I studied for my last book before Everyday Dharma was professional poker players. And I would ask them to describe sort of these moments when they won it all, the championship rounds, like what was that feeling like? And it was frustrating because they couldn't give me very much detail. And details are what make a book. And so I'm like, you're not giving me very much. But then I would ask them to tell me about the moments that they lost. And oh my God, like with Shakespearean detail, they could tell me everything. You know,
Right.
who was at the table, what they were wearing, what the weather was like outside, what the temperature was like inside, every little detail they could tell me. And why? It's because they had replayed that moment over and over and over again. So it almost create this like Netflix of negative memories inside our head with rich tapestries of detail. But when it comes to the positive memories, it's actually pretty sparse. We remember the high level details. And the reason that applies to a concept like this with Dharma is if we understand that about ourselves, we can start to sink our teeth a little bit deeper. We can start to savor a little bit deeper into the moments that we are actually truly enjoying, because those can be little portals. Those can be little windows into what our Dharma really is. So, for example, in the book, I talk about a nurse who really, I mean, she was gifted at her job, but she didn't really like it that much. One of the things she realized is that when she was filling out patient paperwork, she was starting to come alive. And it was the weirdest thing because a lot of nurses that were in her role did not like to do patient paperwork. It was actually seen as like the tedious, like non-sexy part of the job. But the reason that she liked it is because she was able to tell stories. She was able to write about patients at a very human level. And it wasn't just their clinical details, but it was, who was their family? What did they do for a living? What was life like back home? And she found herself really kind of getting into that at a deeper level. And that to her was a signal like, hey, what? That is the brightest spot of my day is when I get to write that paperwork out. And by tuning into that bright spot, she was able to follow that portal. She was able to follow that tunnel into her place of Dharma. She started to write more and more. And it didn't happen overnight, but over the next 9 years, she paved her way into becoming a screenwriter. Right. And again, like the screenwriter part of it wasn't as important. When I talked to her for this book, one of the things she told me is, look, if I became a screenwriter or not, it didn't really matter. The fact is, I discovered what it was that on a daily basis was making me happy. And as soon as I could figure that out, I could start to add a little more to that every single day. That day when she discovered that patient paperwork was her thing, that was really a turning point in her career. So for us, I think the same thing applies, which is like, what are these, even if they're tiny and fleeting, what are these bright spots in our day? And how do we start to align ourselves a little bit more to what that really is?
Your book has really helped me. It's pointing me in a different direction than I would have thought. And it's given me a pause to really look at the foundation of what it is I do. And because I do so many different things, I've been wanting to become more choiceful about what I do. And I realized in thinking about the podcast and my writing and all of the work I've done in brand strategy, um, that the underlying motivation was really about decoding identity,
Mm.
whether it be for a brand or a person or my own research into how we live and behave. And so
Wow.
now, and it's really because of your book that this has happened to me. Um, and so I'm telling this to everybody in the audience. This is like a real genuine case study. Um, it's giving me a lot more clarity around what I want to do in the future. So
That's
thank you
amazing.
for that.
Oh, Debbie, that's amazing. And what a beautiful expression of like essence, decoding identity and all the ways that you've been able to sort of turn that into like different forms of expression. I mean, it is inspiring and thank you. That means a
Thank
lot.
you.
I'm a fan of
Well,
yours.
the book has 8 different ways of thinking about Dharma, 8 skills that you can develop. And the first we've talked about, Sukha, which is uncovering your essence. Another one that I really loved was prana, which is energy over time. And for our sort of hustle-based culture, I thought this was a really important one to talk about. And so if I can just share with the audience, prana is the animating force behind Dharma. And it's an energetic current that buzzes inside you, making you feel alive and energized. And when you tap into your prana, you feel lit up, energized, and creative. When you don't, you can feel depressed, depleted, apathetic, burnt out. The tiniest tasks can sound overwhelming, and the smallest setbacks can seem incapacitating. I have a question about this that I know you can help me understand better. Why is it when something goes wrong, even the tiniest little task, humans tend to globalize and they think, well, if I can't do that, well, then I can't do anything. And
Yeah.
it's a mentality. It's a globalizing mentality, sort of catastrophizing, I think, as Brene Brown would say.
Yeah.
What is your sense of why we do that?
Hmm. Yeah, I think the one of the words that comes to mind for me, Debbie, is exhaustion. I think when we feel exhausted, it can feel like everything is impossible. And I say that because, I think that energy is, I mean, if you look up energy in the dictionary, the definition is going to be something along the lines of your capacity to do work. But I would
Mm,
change that a little bit to say it's your capacity to engage with the world around you. And that's with work, and that's with relationships, that's with anything. And if you're low on that capacity, that I think everything just can feel impossible. And I think the reason that that matters is because we're so fixated on time. Like when we think about what it will take to get something done, like if I asked the people who are here with us today, it was like, you pick something on your to-do list right now that you have to do personally. What is it going to take to get that done? Chances are most people are going to answer in the form of time. It's going to take
mhm.
3 hours. It's going to take 4 hours, right? It's going to take a week. And the reason for that is because we've been so fixated on like streamlining, planning, timing, scheduling. But what I've realized is that after 10 years of research of studying people who I think have been able to really kind of build momentum in their lives and comparing them to people who haven't, the people who fizzle out, they don't run out of time. They run out of energy. They simply just don't have enough gas in the tank to go do what they want to go do, right? And again, the reason that matters is because like if you go to Amazon right now and you look up time management, you're gonna get like 50,000 plus results. But we all feel strangled by time, but we don't know how to manage our energy. And one of the things that I've realized amongst like people who I think have been able to do when we look at them, we're like, how did you pull all of that off? Like, how are you able to build like that world and that world and that world and make it all work? What I've realized about those folks is it's not because they're exceptional at time management. It's because they're exceptional at energy management. They really
Mm.
learn how to manage their energy. Now, again, just like all the concepts in this book, I'm like, wow, I've arrived on something that's like cutting edge. And then I realized it was talked about 1,000 years ago. And this is one of those things. Back in the, when Dharma was being developed, one of the correlating concepts was this idea of prana. And prana is really sort of this extraordinary energy that you have inside of you. And when you're low on prana, you can't really go after your dharma, right? It is very, very hard for you to keep up with your duties, let alone go after your dharma. But when you have prana, when your prana is high, you really feel like you can manage all of this, right? You can engage at a deeper level. And it no longer becomes about, I need to go spend a number of hours on something. It is, I want to give that hour my full prana, because that's the thing about time is that there are only a certain number of minutes in an hour, right? Only 60 minutes an hour, but there's no ceiling to the creative energy that you can bring to each one of those minutes. And that is why we see sometimes like highly creative works be done in like short amounts of time, right? Even today, for some reason, I came across a stat that like Stevie Nicks wrote Dreams for Fleetwood Mac in 10 minutes.
Yeah. And I think she wrote Rhiannon the same day.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It's amazing. Clockwork Orange was written within a week. Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in 2 weeks. Right? But it isn't about time. It is about sort of how do we boost this creative energy inside of us. So this chapter is all about what are the things that I'm noticing amongst people who do an effective job managing their time. What are the daily little rituals they have in their life? But I think the most important message is what is it like taking a careful look at when is your prana the highest? And when is it the lowest? And what are the things that are contributing to that? Because that's probably a combination of tasks, it's people, it's surroundings, right? And some of that is unavoidable, but some of it can actually be controlled. So for me, for example, I know my prana is the highest first thing in the morning. And so I have two priorities. Number one is I want to write for a little bit. And number two is I need to connect with my wife for like, even if it's 15 minutes. We have two young kids. We don't do date night very well. We hardly ever take vacations together, but we do have 15 minutes with each other in the morning before the house goes berserk, where we have a cup of coffee and we can actually look each other in the eyes and we can have a conversation. And that 15 minutes a day is really kind of the bedrock of our relationship. The only reason that came about is because I think both of us are like, when is our prana the highest, right? And what do we want to spend it on? We want to spend it on each other, and we want to spend it on our most creative work.
One thing I think is really important for the audience to hear is that, and I learned this from your book, the qualities we associate with hustle, always being on, working nonstop, being relentless, are some of the same qualities that are scientifically associated with burnout. And that was a startling realization. I think I only have time for one more question. There goes my 8 other pages of questions. This
Sorry
one
for the
is
lengthy answers.
this one I think is a really helpful one for everyone. You share a really interesting and somewhat terrifying fact in your book. According to the Cleveland Clinic, people have up to 70,000 thoughts every single day. And researchers estimate that around 90% of those are duplicates of a thought that you had yesterday. The majority of those duplicate thoughts also tend to skew negative. They contain at least a hint of fear, anxiety, or doubt. And you talk about in your book something called a worry break. And I'm wondering if you can share that with the audience, because it's yet another practical tool that you share that can help get us out of this spiral that we go through every single day in our lives, and things we tell ourselves are wrong.
Yeah, and because when we're in the spiral, we can't be present with the other parts of our life. We can't be present with our work. We can't be present with the people around us. Try to be, but there's often some background noise that's kind of pulling us out of that moment. Then often that background noise is a worry. It's a fear. It's something that we're thinking about that we have to do, that we think might go wrong. One of the tools that I think we have been conditioned to practice is compartmentalization, right? To basically say, I don't have time for that right now, so I'm going to sort of push that to the side and I'm going to focus on what's in front of me. But what a lot of research is showing us right now is that compartmentalization isn't very effective. We can be present enough, but we can't be fully engaged when we have this thing that's creating all the static in the background. And so counterintuitively, one of the things that we notice high performers do is take what I call a worry break, which is that instead of ignoring that thing, which will often grow from a whisper into a conversation into a scream, instead of ignoring it, spend deliberate time with it, meaning literally to budget. It could be just a few minutes, budget a few minutes to say, all right, I'm going to focus on nothing but that one worry. And the example that I have in the book is I have a dear friend who is very high up inside a company and she came to me one day and she's like, look, I'm having a very difficult time not worrying every single day about climate change. Like I can't do my work and I can't be with my family the way that I want to be because I just think about it all the time. And I was just at the point in time in my book where I was coming across this research and I had her test this out. And I said, look, I think the worst piece of advice would be it's all going to be okay, right? Like, or to say like it's, don't worry about it, it's all going to be fine. But what if you were, instead of letting it be something that's detracting in little bits throughout your whole day, what if you were to give it 5 to 10 minutes every day where you actually budgeted time to say, I'm just going to worry about climate change. And I'm going to allow myself to catastrophize. I'm going to allow myself to do whatever I need to do during that 5 to 10 minutes. What would happen? And what happened to her is what these studies have showed, which is that it doesn't solve the problem necessarily, but what it will actually do counterintuitively is it will turn the volume down. Because in some ways you've almost invited the worry in, you've allowed it to have a voice, you've allowed it to be heard, and in some ways you've kind of exhausted it a little bit, at least for today. And then that allows you to be more present with the other parts of your day. I have now tested this out with lots and lots of teams and executives who are like, come on, this is just going to fuel my anxiety, isn't it? And I've said, no, just give it a shot. And it does work like a charm. If something is bothering you instead of trying to push it out, find a little bit of time, pull it in, pull it closer to you, spend 5 minutes just focusing on that one thing, and then notice what happens with the other parts of your day.
It works.
It works.
Suneel Gupta, thank you for writing this book. It is a book that is really unusual. It's soulful and practical at the same time, and it's really beautiful. Thank you so much.
Debbie, thank you so much. Thanks for joining me with this. I really appreciate it.
Debbie, thank you for a really thoughtful, personal, insightful, disciplined interview. I really, really, really appreciated it. You brought both yourself and that big brain of yours. All of you came to the interview and we're very grateful. Suneel was well served in the conversation. I want to remind folks that Suneel is going to stick around for after hours, which will begin at 8:05 p.m. Central, which is about 8 minutes from now. How do you get to come to after hours and ask this very sharp man your own questions about your own path in life? As you see, though, he's willing to say, I don't know the answer, so be ready for that as well, which is perfectly good. The way you can come, we've been putting in links in chat. You can buy a copy of Everyday Dharma from our indie bookseller partner, The Bookstall. In your receipt that you get via email will be a link to register for after hours. So come hang out, come join us, ask your own questions. Suneel, I am going to pose one question to you that was posed actually on the registration form, which I think is, considering we have almost 70 schools that are part of FAN, I think this is kind of a significant piece. And you did touch on it a little bit tangentially in some ways. This question was for young people in their mid-20s in the few years after college, feeling so lost in purpose and life, what would you tell them?
I would tell them I was exactly the same way. And it took me a lot longer than just my 20s to figure this out. I would say that, you know, there's probably some things that are inside this book that are not going to make sense. This idea of outer success and inner success, I think if somebody tried to tell me that in my 20s, I probably wouldn't have paid attention. What I would say, though, is that tuning in to the things that non-conceptually make you happy. And what I mean by that is like not just in theory, they're the things that like you want to go do, but at a non-conceptual level, the more that we can sort of tune into what is energetically drawing us in, I think the better. Because that, and the reason that I say that for somebody in their early 20s is because I don't think that that happens overnight. I don't think that all of a sudden you say to somebody, hey, tune in energetically, and they can do it. I think that it's a feeling that is developed. And the earlier that we can do that, I think the better. Like, so for me with my kids, that's the kind of thing that I mean, there's a lot of practices inside this book that just would not make sense, would not compute, not now, probably not in high school, and probably not in college. But the more that I can get them to tune into like what are things doing, how are they responding to, the work that they're doing, how are they responding to when they're interacting with certain people, interacting with certain types of work, that I think lays the foundation for everything else that's inside.
Enhanced self-awareness, always a
Yeah.
good thing. Okay, we're at 8 o'clock. And so thank you so much, Debbie. And it was really a pleasure getting to know you. Glad to have you as part of the FAN family. Suneel, we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Everybody, thanks for joining us. Come hang out with Gloria Mark tomorrow. She'll have some things to say about attention and attention span and why it's so hard today to focus. It's going to be a great program. So thanks, everybody. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much. Have a great night.